Hey there, it's Dr. Barbara Woods with the Intergenerational Trauma Therapist Show. And today we are going to be talking about pillar number 2 of the Intergenerational Resilience Method. And that is the power of attachment in transforming intergenerational trauma. So, did you know that the most cutting edge therapy for intergenerational trauma has its roots in the neuroscience of connection? And we're going to discuss that today and find out why that is and why it's so important to have those roots in that neuroscience. So, we are going to look at first just kind of the general science of attachment, kind of a little bit of a review, attachment disruptions in specifically intergenerational trauma cases and how those may look similar or different, addressing or assessing attachment in intergenerational trauma cases because it's quite different, and interventions for healing. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the intergenerational resilience method and how that all fits together. So let's review first why it's so complicated to work with attachment in these complex families that have had huge intergenerational trauma impacts. First of all, it's because these patterns are very deeply rooted. These are sometimes generations deep that people don't even recognize that it's a pattern that is maybe unhealthy or maybe we should look at changing it. This is just the way life is, and they don't know any different sometimes. So they're just very deeply rooted. So they're deeply rooted because they're generational in nature, but they're also deeply rooted in the individual because these are survival instincts that get triggered and then get kind of passed along to new generations. So they're very highly specific to survival. They're hardwired, and sometimes they take on a life of their own if there's no intervention. It can also be more difficult because the complex trauma histories of the parents that you're working with, because they've been dealt a pretty difficult hand to cope with and deal with. They may not have gotten any kind of support for how they cope with that or how they make changes. So it's really difficult. That complex trauma history, although it's expected, it's actually adaptive, and we have to work around that, but that can make another level or layer of intergenerational trauma therapy that makes it quite complex and difficult. There's also that transgenerational transmission where trauma gets transmitted between the generations through attachment and neglect, all those kinds of things that in trauma experiences, rather than like a single event that happens that may kind of throw the relationship off and cause some attachment disruptions. These are deeply rooted, intergenerationally transmitted difficulties. We also need to integrate that neuroscience. And if you are like me, I'm a neuroscience nerd or nut, and I love neuroscience, but it can be really complicated to go from the science part into the applied. So sometimes it's hard to figure out, how do you talk to parents about flourishing neural connections and pruning in the brain? So how do you bring that to them in a way that they understand it and kind of hooks them into the treatment process so that they want to learn more and they're motivated and they'll use the interventions? There can also be a very high range of emotional dysregulation, high reactivity, or very extreme shutdown. So these are layers or levels that make it more complicated to treat. You're not just going in and treating one parent-child relationship. You're treating huge impacts from generations that result in a lot of emotional dysregulation and really sometimes very few skills to be able to regulate their emotions, which then supports the relationship with their child. And the children can be highly, highly emotionally dysregulated as well. And we're going to look at that a little bit when we talk about attachment a little bit deeper and the impacts of in utero and early developmental environment. So, parents who have and children who have been impacted by intergenerational trauma, sometimes they're very defensive in the therapy setting. They're very uncomfortable, avoidant. They don't want to participate. They don't trust it. They don't see how it'll help. They may not even recognize that this is a problem because this is how everybody in our family is. So, that defensiveness and the ambivalence can be a real difficult thing to deal with in the intergenerational trauma therapy because it throws monkey wrenches into the whole intervention system. So we have to really know what to look for and how to support them to kind of draw them in and give them experiences to learn that they can trust therapy and that these interventions work, and we just go slow at their pace. Another complicating factor is that we are working with multiple generations. So we're not just working with one parent child dyad, we're working with sometimes impacts of grandparents, great grandparents. So it gets more and more complex because of that intergenerational piece. And sometimes in some of the families impacted by intergenerational trauma, you'll see a really common dynamic where the parent may have lost custody or has allowed the grandparent to take care of the child or the grandchild, and it can create some real difficulties related to healing intergenerational trauma and kind of getting the relationships in a healthy manner between all those generations, even if the parent is either absent or not as involved and the grandparent is raising the child. But that's a common difficulty that sometimes will be there because the parent has to be important in the child's life for mental health. So it doesn't have to be visiting every day, every week, but there has to be some kind of positive regard for the parent in the family system, even if there's huge struggles there. So that can be really complicated for therapists. And the last thing is just the high rates of burnout and overwhelm because of the complexity of these cases. They can be really difficult to feel like you're making progress and to feel good about what you're doing and to kind of feel like you know what you're doing. So those are all the things that make it so complicated to work with these cases. Now we're going to talk about how to get around all those things and the difficulties and the complications when we're working with intergenerational trauma. So we're going to review a little bit of the science of attachment. Basic attachment theory is basically secure versus insecure strategies. Now we look at these as strategies rather than styles or categories because they tend to be very fluid. You can have a secure attachment with one person and an anxious or avoidant attachment with another. And children can often do this in their families as well. So their attachment strategies may be very different based on the adult that they're working with or that they're attaching with. So secure is basically being able to tolerate separation. It might be distressing, but when the parent comes back, there's kind of a reunion, there's some comforting, and it's okay. Anxious attachment strategies are this is the child that when you have to take a shower, they're at the bathroom door, like, where are you? Why are you in there so long? When are you going to be out? And they're just very kind of preoccupied and very, very anxious about the caregiver and having close proximity to the caregiver. The avoidant styles and strategies are basically kind of a disconnect or a shutdown to relationships. They may appear a little bit aloof. They may get frustrated when the parent leaves and then they come back. They may not even be phased. Even though they look like they're okay and they're not upset by separation from the caregiver, their brain and body is always searching for attachment. So no matter how shut down a child is, they are still searching for attachment and connection with a caring adult. The last category of strategies is the disorganized. So this is where there's either no predictability in how the child interacts with the caregiver. They may be very punitive and controlling. So these are the ones that will steal their purse so they can't leave. They will be very demanding and controlling and saying, you need to do this now, and just very difficult and demanding, bossy kind of things. Or the one that gets overlooked a lot is they can be very um, caretaking and controlling. So they control everything, their siblings, their parents, by controlling the entire situation. And they don't look like they're using disorganized strategies, because as long as they're in that role, they can kind of keep it together. Once you remove them from that role, if you separate them from their siblings, or if they maybe go to a foster home and the foster parent says, you are not going to take care of these younger kids, that's my job, you be a kid, it will throw that child into like a straight panic, because that's how they're managing their attachment anxiety and how they've survived through what they've had to survive through. So that can be a really difficult group of strategies. It's also the hallmark of intergenerational trauma. So wherever you see disorganized attachment strategies, you are highly likely to find intergenerational trauma as well. So we're going to look at the impact of attachment disruptions on brain development. And basically, there was some criteria developed by, I'm going to mispronounce this, Spinazzola, Vanderkolk, and Ford. There's a 2021 article that is the criterion for developmental trauma disorder. They have not been able to get this in the DSM, but it does give us kind of a framework to work from, and it's very useful with intergenerational trauma. Basically, the categories of impacts is, first, there has to be some type of ongoing trauma during a critical developmental period, or relational trauma that has occurred during childhood. The symptoms are, or criterion, are emotional and somatic dysregulation. So that's your high emotional volatility or shutdown. And it's also kind of being either disconnected or highly preoccupied with somatic complaints. Attention and behavioral dysregulation is the next criterion. So that's difficulties paying attention. They may almost look like they have ADHD, but they're more likely having hypervigilance or impulsiveness related to the developmental impacts of trauma. They can also overlap. And behavioral dysregulation. So this is where they can't manage their behavior very well. They can't sit well in classes, or they don't have any motivation to participate in physical activities. So all those types of impacts. And then the last criterion is relational or self-dysregulation. So that's having complicated relationships. So the attachment strategies are more destructive. Although they're adaptive, they do tend to make the attachment relationship harder to work with. And the self-dysregulation is what we talk about when we look at the self-beliefs of the child, like I'm no good, nobody loves me, I'm damaged. Those kind of cognitions are linked into that self-dysregulation. They may also have negative beliefs related to relationships as well. So when we look at the causes and consequences of attachment disruptions in intergenerational trauma, the causes are typically, they can be more varied than this, but the typical causes of intergenerational trauma impacts on attachment are three types. There's in utero development, early developmental environment, and the parent's unresolved trauma. So basically, in utero, there are emotional circuits that are developing at different critical stages. And if those emotional circuits are not developed as well because the mother's under so much stress that there's a lot of cortisol in her body, it takes the developmental focus off that developing that emotional circuit more into dealing with that cortisol and surviving. And it causes that emotional circuit to not be as strong or not to have as large of structures. So the structure and function can be lessened if there's a lot of stress in the in utero stages. The early developmental environment is typically from 0 to 3. There's critical periods during this. This is really the foundation of attachment. That's the time frame where these strategies typically develop, although they're flexible and we can get some change in there. This is really kind of where they're strongly rooted and develop. So there's additional emotional and regulational circuits and relational circuits that develop that if there's stress in the environment or there's neglect, abuse, separation, all those kinds of things can have a huge impact on that second developing circuit. And that negatively impacts attachment. So the parent's unresolved complex trauma sometimes interferes with their ability to connect and attach with their child because they have difficulties self-regulating. And if you can't self-regulate, it's hard to co-regulate with being regulated rather than dysregulated. It's very easy to be co-regulate with dysregulation, but it's harder to soothe and comfort someone else if you're already having trouble being self-regulated yourself. And that self-regulation and co-regulation, those are the foundations of attachment. If we don't have that, the attachment relationship is going to be impacted by that. And those, although adaptive strategies that become problematic, will start to develop. So what this will look like is the parent may be inconsistent in their responsiveness. So when the stress is low and they're somewhat regulated, they'll be really responsive to their child. They'll be on it when they cry. They'll be comforting. They'll be feeding them when they're hungry. But when they're totally stressed out, they may neglect that. They may not have the capacity to be consistently there for the child or for the infant. So that can lead to some neglect. It can lead to emotional kind of developmental neglect. It can also lead to physical neglect of nutrition and those kinds of things, which ultimately can end up causing a separation between the parent and infant or child due to the neglect or abuse or dangerous circumstances, because child welfare or child protection will step in if that's happening. Which creates another level and layer of attachment impacts. Although it has to happen for the safety and security of the child, it still causes a lot of impacts on attachment. The last way that the parent's unresolved complex trauma impacts the attachment is that the parent becomes either scary or scared. And this is a hallmark, again, of disorganized attachment. So the parent may be very scary, that they're very volatile, they're very angry, they're very kind of in that fight mode, and they may even be abusive. So they're either scary or they are so scared that they don't have the capacity to protect and offer the child security, so the child offers them security. And these are the kids that'll, 5 years old, they'll stand up to an abuser and stand between the parent and the abuser and try to get them to go away. Very brave, very survival oriented, very adaptive, very damaging for attachment. So neuroscience in understanding attachment disruptions, it's a critical foundation. We have to have that neuroscience background, but we also have to be able to apply it, which can be the hard parts. So the areas we need to be able to apply that neuroscience is in identifying the impacts on both individuals and the family system. So we have to know, how does all this complexity filter down and impact this individual kind of group or this generation of family members? And how does it impact the family system overall? We also want to use this neuroscience to fine tune our interventions that are specifically targeted for the impacts in their presentation. So if you have a parent that is doing quite well, maybe has some difficulties with having periods of emotional dysregulation because of what they went through, but they work, they do well, they have a lot of stability, but it's still impacting them. That's going to be a lot different intervention strategies and flow than if it's a parent that's highly volatile, angry, and is always in kind of fight or flight mode. So we have to be able to fine tune our interventions for whatever kind of presentation comes into our office. So we have to have highly tailored treatment plans that are highly individualized for the individuals within the family, so the parent, the child, the teen, but also for that family as a whole, of how do we navigate this to get the most calming and stability in the family system we can get right from the start. So we also have to have flexibility to meet current needs when there's crises or chaos that happens, because a lot of times these families have a lot of chaos that happens, and it's not anything they're doing or bringing kind of into the family system. It's the environment in which they grew up in, and it's why they're in this situation. So we have to know when we need to meet those needs, but is it at risk of throwing kind of the outcomes or our path of therapy, our treatment plan? Will it throw that off? So there are appropriate times where we need to work on stabilization if there's something that's happened that is destabilizing the parent or the child. But we also have to keep focused on those outcomes and those goals so that we aren't always in crisis mode and never get to the end outcomes. Okay. So how do we assess attachment in intergenerational trauma therapy? So traditional assessment is typically the parent-child, maybe both parents and the child. We look at them and their interactions. We identify their attachment strategies. We want to kind of know, are they in the cluster of anxious, avoidant, disorganized? And then we develop interventions to create the conditions to build more secure attachment strategies, to have positive experiences. We want the child to have positive experiences. We also want the parent to have positive experiences, because that is one of the joys of parenting, is those gushy, good moments where you just feel really close and connected with your child. And we may recognize attachment glitches in the parent, and we might intervene. However, our focus is mainly on the parent-child relationship and not really addressing the parents' impacts of possible trauma that is unresolved. So we may refer them to another therapist to work on that stuff. But when you have intergenerational trauma, because of the complexity, we have to have as much efficiency and effectiveness in our treatments as we can, so that it builds hope. They see that things can change and they're motivated to stay in therapy. Sending them off to another therapist, they may use a whole different type of interventions that may work, but they're not going to be kind of a seamless transition between the therapies that you do with family members. So in intergenerational trauma therapy, I use the 5 domains of assessment, where we look at the 5 main areas where you'll see the impacts of intergenerational trauma. So the first one is the negative impacts on therapy itself. So you'll see parents that are reluctant to engage. They're distant. They're difficult to even get to come in to sign paperwork. They may have somebody else drop the child off. They're avoidant of engaging in therapy, or They absolutely do not like the interventions you're using, especially if they're play therapy or creative or art type interventions, because they want that behavior managed. They want the behavior fixed. So if you hear, I need you to fix my kid, you need to cue in, just like with disorganized attachment, that this may be some impacts of intergenerational attachment, and they're highly focused on the behavior, which may make your interventions very difficult, particularly if you use a lot of play therapy and more creative therapies. They also have difficulties in co-regulation. So they may never have experienced co-regulation with a caring person as a child themselves and then into adulthood. So they can't self-regulate. So very volatile, very reactive, or very shut down. And then they can't offer co-regulation to their child. And out of that, because parenting is very difficult in general, but with all these complications, it can be even more difficult. So they start to have the next category of what we look at in assessing intergenerational trauma impacts is called the negative mentalization of the child. So these are things like, he's out to get me, he's trying to drive me nuts, he's trying to make me crazy. Those kinds of things where they attribute the behavior of the child to really negative internal characteristics of the child. So these aren't the parents that are going to say, oh, he must have been really frustrated. He was mad at me. It's okay. I set a boundary. That was expected. It will be, that kid is trying to drive me nuts. So that's another hallmark that you really have to look for, is how does the parent conceptualize the child's mind and their motivation and their behavior. And then out of all three of those, you'll see parenting strategies that backfire. So you could see very harsh punishment, controlling, kind of corporal punishment, standing in a corner, kneeling, sitting, physical abuse type interventions that are really damaging to the parent-child bond. Or you might see complete shutdown and very, I don't care what you do because you're going to do it anyway. So just go do what you're going to do. And they don't have the structure or the guidance for the child or the boundaries. So then what you'll see in the child is you'll see those negative self-beliefs, which is one of those criteria for developmental trauma disorder. So you'll see them say things like, I'm not a good person. Nobody loves me. I'm not safe. The world is a horrible place. And these negative self-beliefs can be transmitted from within the family. So the parents may be warning and telling the child that you can't trust anybody. The world is a terrible place. People are just going to let you down. That they may develop those more in relationship to the family system than just their own experiences, or both. So the importance of a specialized approach with assessment is because these domains are critical to identify your treatment goals. So if you have a parent that has really, they can co-regulate, but they have really parenting strategies that just really backfire, you know where to spend the bulk of your time and make sure they're co-regulating well and they're regulated themselves. But you may want to work more on the parenting strategies, or you may notice that they have really strong negative mentalizations of their children. So you might want to work on that more. So we really need to know this information to identify our treatment goals so that we can tailor it to the needs of each family. These are complex families and no two families are exactly the same. So we have to have that flexibility. So the impacts of intergenerational trauma, they tend to be more systemic. So they're within the family system rather than symptomatic in one person. And yes, they are symptomatic in a person, but it's in the context of these systemic impacts that we really need to keep watch on, because if we treat an individual that's in a system that is its own kind of self-organizing system that will keep going regardless of how this person changes, especially if it's a child in the system, it's going to drag that person right back into the dynamics that were there before. So the therapy probably won't be as effective as if there's not some degree of change in the family system as well. So the interventions for healing attachment disruptions are really, for me, they are all rooted in neuroscience and relational neuroscience and polyvagal interventions. So polyvagal interventions are extremely important for us to co-regulate with the parent and the child if we're doing work with both of them, so that they get that experience of having someone that cares and can co-regulate with them, and then they can learn to self-regulate, and that will support attachment. That co-regulation and self-regulation is really one of the key foundations to attachment. And the relational neuroscience, basically what we're doing is we're building new neural pathways related to connection, co-regulation, relationship. And over time, those old pathways of defense, fear, aggression, they may prune back or they may become less effective. So, and that's what we want. We want these new pathways to be really strong. So we need to know the neuroscience behind how do you kind of cultivate that in the brain. When we're building secure attachments, the most important thing is to address the parent's unresolved trauma to clear the way for that positive attachment with their child. They deserve to have that cleared away because they didn't ask for the situation that they're in. They didn't cause it. It came to them very honestly, and they did the best that they could at the time. We just now know that there's different strategies and different ways of parenting and being able to take care of ourselves that support the healing in the family. So any improvements, even if you can't completely clear out and create 100% healthy family, which I don't know if that even exists, but if there's any improvements in attachment, in self-regulation, co-regulation, if you address those impacts, any improvements will slow down the transmission to the next generation. So anything you do, you can slow that down. Now, there are some parents that I've worked with that in one generation, they have put a dead stop to the transmission of some of the things that they went through. It's been really hard on them, and it's a really high price to pay and a lot of work, but they've stopped a lot of the difficulties, but there's still healing that needs to happen. So any improvements in a family system or individual can help shift that transmission or slow it down. So the therapy relationship in intergenerational trauma therapy becomes critical because this is the core of how a parent or a child re-experiences relationship that's healthy and secure. So we provide a new experience in a container for the parent. It may be the first time this parent's experienced any kind of co-regulation and healthy, secure interactions. Now, we don't go to the extent of parenting them. We just have a healthy therapeutic relationship that helps build a different experience for them. So the parent's experience with our co-regulation will improve their self-regulation. That improved self-regulation supports co-regulation with their child and ultimately more effective and secure attachment strategies. So the therapy relationship with the child can provide a new experience for the child as well, in a relationship with an adult that allows them to kind of gracefully adapt to receiving co-regulation and experiencing more secure attachment-related interactions, which some kids, because of the impacts and the severity of the trauma, they may need kind of that surrogate person that helps them experience that, so that when they experience it with their parent, they can trust it and feel secure in that. Again, we don't become their parent and we don't have that depth of a relationship, but we provide them the experience and foundation of that. So in the intergenerational trauma program, there's three really strong pillars. There's specialization and expertise. There's a compassionate community and cutting edge knowledge. So we're going to go through all three of these to see how they interact and are important for an intergenerational trauma therapist. So with specialization and expertise, the intergenerational trauma program, it's highly specialized specifically for this niche. It was designed and created for this niche, although you can use it, you can use the different phases for all kinds of different cases. You can use phase one, where we calm the family nervous system for parent coaching. You can use phase two, which is addressing complex trauma with just an individual that you're working with and not maybe a young adult that doesn't even have children. And the last one, for building resilience in the family, you can use it for people who are not impacted by intergenerational trauma. And the children's part of that phase can also be used individually with children if you don't have permission, access, or ability to work with the parents. So it really provides therapists with a very efficient, it gets in there, does what it needs to do, and gives them hope and confidence. And it's effective, and it's a framework that addresses those specific intergenerational trauma impacts. We need that compassionate community because of the degree of complexity and the rate of burnout and overwhelm that can happen with these cases. Sometimes these cases are so challenging that they cause us to even think about leaving the profession or changing niches or not taking these cases anymore. So finding support and getting consultation helps each therapist to be stronger, and it helps us carry the complexity of these cases. And the cutting edge knowledge is really using neuroscience, the relational neuroscience and polyvagal interventions, child development information for in that three-phase intervention. So the first phase is calming the family nervous system. It's working with the parent to develop their own sense of regulation through our co-regulation and being able to offer co-regulation to their child, and also addressing attachment and burnout in parents and some mindful parenting skills. And we do this because we want to stabilize the family as much as we can, and we want to take the heat out of the defensiveness or the shutdown in the family system. So we want that to kind of we want to provide as much stabilization in the system as we can. The second phase is the complex trauma therapy for the parent or caregiver. This is to help clear out those complex trauma impacts that may have an impact on the parent-child relationship. They deserve that healing. They came by this quite honestly, and they too deserve to have the freedom from those impacts. Then the third phase is it's trauma therapy for the child or teen. So clearing out and addressing what they've experienced, while we're also building connection and family resilience within the family. So there you have it. That's the second pillar of the intergenerational resilience method. The first pillar was autonomic resilience. Second pillar is attachment. Third pillar is supporting child development. And fourth pillar is building connection and family resilience. So next week, we're going to be looking at supporting child development in families impacted by intergenerational trauma. So we're going to do a deeper dive into that developmental trauma disorder. And this is because it's so critical, because this is where the transmission stops for the next generation, is addressing those developmental impacts. If you have not gotten your copy of the 2024 Intergenerational Trauma Therapist Immersion Calendar, you can go to calendar.barbarawoodspphd.com, and you can follow along with daily prompts weekly themes and monthly themes, which is what we're going through today. This week's topic was increasing secure attachment under the theme of the intergenerational resilience model. So I hope you have enjoyed this. I hope to see you next week. And if you have not joined my Intergenerational Trauma Therapist Support and Strategies Facebook group, be sure to do that. I'll post a link around this video. Have a great day, and I'll see you next week.